So I grew up in a small town in Texas, South Texas to be exact. It was the kind of town where your last name gets you to places long before you do. The kind of place where the grocery store was not just where you bought your milk or your bread or your hamburger meat. It was where you got seen. It's also where you got remembered, where you got measured. Sometimes you were forgiven. Sometimes you were judged by the people who had known you since you were too young to know better. Small towns have a way of raising you twice. First, they raise you as a child. But then, if you're foolish or brave enough to come back many years later, they raise questions that you were not old enough to ask the first time around. When I was young, my hometown was small in the very old-fashioned way. We had a small little grocery store, one independent market with a meat market in the back, a few diners, a few local businesses, a couple of chains, and a sense that the town had edges, but not just geographic edges. I'm talking economic edges, social edges, and imaginative edges. Now, there was a ceiling in the sky, even if nobody called it that. So I left. I left as a young man and went out into the world. I got an education. I learned how systems worked. I learned how money moves. I learned how institutions protect themselves. I also learned how opportunity gets packaged, how it gets guarded, how it gets distributed, and sometimes how opportunity gets withheld. Now, I learned that the world is not always ran by the smartest people. It's also not ran by the kindest or even the hardest working of people. A lot of time, the world is just ran by people who understand systems well enough to move inside it without asking it for permission. So years later, I came back, and the town looked different. The little grocery store world had been replaced by the bigger stores, the bigger parking lots, the chain retailers, a super Walmart, an H-E-B, a Tractor Supply, pizza chains that were just trying to survive, local diners that were still hanging on. There was the usual growth that you expect when a small town gets pulled into the orbit of a growing metropolitan area. And on paper, that looks like progress. But standing there on the corner looking around, I had harder questions. Did the town simply grow, or did the people rise? Because those are not the same thing. Now, you see, a town can grow, but it can not necessarily create opportunity. A town can add rooftops, it can add parking lots, chain stores, gas stations, drive-through lanes, and enough beige commercial architecture to make a person question whether or not beauty has been outlawed by county ordinance, but it still doesn't give people a better shot at moving upward. That's just not how that works. That's where we have to separate two ideas that often get thrown into the same bucket. Let's talk a little bit about social mobility. Social mobility means movement. People moving in, people moving out, people changing jobs, changing neighborhoods, changing class positions, changing social networks, changing how a town works and who works for it. Now, a town can have social mobility because it becomes less isolated, because new residents arrive, because old families leave. This is how this happens. But upward mobility, we were just talking about social mobility. Now let's talk about upward mobility. Upward mobility is much harder. Upward mobility means that people are actually rising. There's better wages, better education, more ownership, more security, better health, more savings, more choices. Children having a real shot at a better life than the ones that their parents had. Coincidentally, we call that intergenerational mobility, right? Now, here's the cleanest way that I know how to say this. All upward mobility is social mobility. But not all social mobility is upward mobility. Sometimes people move because they're climbing. Sometimes people move because they're being squeezed. And sometimes the town changes around them while their actual options don't really change much at all. That's what I saw when I came home. I saw commercial growth, but I wasn't sure I saw structural change. I saw bigger retail, but not necessarily bigger futures. And friends, that distinction mattered because retail growth can fool us. A big box store looks like progress and it feels like progress. It has lights, shelves, jobs, sales tax, a parking lot big enough to land a helicopter on, right? It photographs well. It gives local officials something to point at. It gives people convenience. And convenience, I want to say something kind about this. Convenience is not nothing. Anybody who's ever had to drive 30 or 40 miles for decent groceries or, for a decent meal, they know that. Convenience is something. But convenience is not the same thing as mobility. Sometimes retail growth is just the economy saying, hey, congratulations. You now have more places to spend the money that you're struggling to earn, right? That's not a ladder. That's what we call a checkout line. So now I'm not saying that small towns don't need retail, because they do. People need groceries. They need hardware. They need pharmacies to buy their prescriptions. They need places to buy school supplies, tires, work pants, medicine, dog food, you name it, right? A frozen pizza at 10 o'clock at night because the day went sideways and nobody's going to cook, right? But a town needs more than just places to buy things. A town needs places to become things. Things like a nurse, become a welder, maybe, become a teacher, become an electrician, become a business owner, become a contractor, become a mechanic, uh, become an accountant, become a person with options. You see, when you have options, you can negotiate. You can leave a bad job. You can start a business. You can move if you want to. You can stay if you want to. You can buy if you're ready. You can tell a bad opportunity to go find another fool. But when you don't have options, you start calling that a survival plan, right? And too many towns across America have gotten very comfortable with survival. We often celebrate growth because growth is easy to measure. The population went up, the sales tax went up, appraisals went up, a new chain store opened, a ribbon got cut, somebody smiled for a picture with the ceremonial scissors, right? It kind of looks like they had been personally dragged, to this thing. But anyway, the real question here is not whether the town grew, because the town did probably add some new rooftops. They added some new citizens. The real question here is not whether the town grew. The real question is whether the people who live in that town gained power. Can young families buy homes? Can local kids get trained for serious careers without being treated like leftovers, right? Can workers earn enough money to live in the town where they work, right? Can small businesses survive the next national crisis between Democrats and Republicans? Can people build wealth, or are they just paying more to kind of stand still? I think the bigger question is can a child born in that town imagine a future that's bigger than retail shifts, long commutes, and hoping that somebody important finally notices the place? That's the heart of upward mobility, not just movement. I mean, it's power, not just growth. It's possibility. And when I was young, when I was a young man, leaving felt like the path towards upward mobility. And I don't say that with any bitterness at all. I say it because it's true. I had to leave to see the larger world. I had to leave to understand systems. I had to leave to understand how education, how money, how institutions, politics, class, all of that fit together in ways that nobody explained at the local church or at the local diner. And that pattern is all over America. Small towns rise because they recognize growth did not mean upward mobility. Now, again, small towns raise people who often have to leave the small town in order to rise. Then those people come back many years later and they see that the town has changed. But the old bargain that you had there may not have changed much at all. The stores are bigger, the roads are busier, the rooftops have probably multiplied. The brands have arrived, right? But you ask yourself the question, are the ladders taller today? Because I think there is a kind of growth that makes a town look successful from the highway, while the people inside that town just off the highway are still fighting like hell with the same old battle. The battle for decent wages, the battle for affordable housing, the battle for reliable health care, the battle for good schools, the battle for training, the battle for a shot at some sort of ownership, the battle to not have your future determined by your zip code before you're old enough to even put it on an envelope. That's not just a South Texas story. This is happening all over America. Small towns near growing metropolitan areas are being pulled into something bigger themselves. They absorb the housing pressure. They absorb the traffic commute, or the commuter traffic, I mean. They absorb the retail chains. They absorb the newcomers. They absorb the higher property value. They absorb the cultural friction. They absorb the strange little civil war between the way things used to be and the way that it's becoming. And I think local leaders often talk about that as progress. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just pressure wearing a hard hat. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the growth does not come with pathways. It kind of becomes a trap. If housing values rise, but wages don't, growth becomes this thing we call exclusion. And if chain stores arrive, but local ownership disappears, then growth becomes dependence. If a kid graduates but has no clear next steps, growth becomes a waiting room. If the only way to rise above the small town situation is to leave, then that's just what you have to do. Let me rephrase that. Let me re-say that. If the only way to rise is to leave, then the town is not producing upward mobility. It's exploring ambition. And then possibly it's kind of just exporting ambition too, if you want to put it that way. Because a healthy hometown, I don't think, should punish ambition. It should not make its bright young people choose between belonging and becoming. It needs to give them roots, but it also needs to provide them with some wings, because roots matter. I do believe that. I do not let some overeducated consultant with soft hands and a rented blazer tell me that roots are backwards. Roots are memories. Roots are obligation. Roots are family. Roots are the church pews, the school gyms, the funeral processions, the old teachers, the old grudges, the man who pulls over when your truck's on the side of the road because he knew your dad. That's the power of roots, right? But roots aren't necessarily wings. A town that gives people only roots might keep them close, but they also keep them small. A town that gives people only wings might produce success, but no loyalty. The best places give people both. They give them enough belonging to know who they are. They give them enough opportunity to become who they could be. And that's what upward mobility really means. It doesn't mean that every kid has to become a lawyer, has to become a doctor, an engineer, or some corporate climber with dead eyes. This is not India 1990. This is the United States 2026. It means that every kid deserves a real pathway forward, a path into skill, a path into ownership, a path into stability, a path into dignity, a path into a life where one bad month does not destroy 10 years worth of effort. And I think if we want that, we have to stop confusing growth with human development. A new store is not a workforce strategy. A new subdivision is not an education plan. A new sales tax bump is not a moral vision, right? Traffic is not prosperity. A town needs ladders. And I'm talking about real ladders. Career and technical education tied to actual job. Apprenticeships with employers. Those are important. Community college partnerships that do not require young people to navigate a maze designed by bored bureaucrats. Okay? That's bullshit. We need all of these things, because the question is not, can we get bigger? We can get bigger. The question is, can we get better? Bigger and better are not the same damn thing. When I was a kid, I was a fat little kid, and people used to say, "Oh, look at man, he's healthy looking. He's eating not me missing too many meals. He's fat and healthy." Years later, you find out that just because you were big doesn't necessarily mean you were healthy. You were just fat, and there's a lot of truth to that. And that's why I came back to my hometown, and I saw this. I saw the stores, I saw the traffic, I saw the signs of growth, but I kept looking for the ladders. There just weren't any ladders. Not just in my hometown, not just in South Texas, but in everywhere, When somebody says a town is growing, you need to ask yourself who gets to rise because of this growth. When somebody says that this development is coming, you need to ask yourself, development for who? When somebody says a new retailer is opening, you need to ask yourself, will this create paths to ownership, to skills, to better wages, or just more places to spend paychecks that are already too damn small? Because remember this, growth, this is what they teach you in demographics. Growth is a number. Mobility is a story. Upward mobility is a promise. And if a town grows without helping its people rise, then it hasn't really built a future, has it? It's built a crowd. Well, America has enough crowds. We need more ladders. I'm Matt Pierce. Thanks for joining me.